across occupied territories bore witness to the consequences of absolute focus. Villages near supply routes became targets of sabotage, resistance groups struck key logistical points, and the ever-present tension of occupation weighed heavily on daily life. Every action, every calculated risk taken by German forces reverberated through Europe, shaping the destinies of soldiers and civilians alike. The moral and strategic dilemmas faced in Berlin mirrored the tension on the ground. Concentrated power had produced victories, yet every success carried potential peril. Overconfidence, stretched supply lines, and the looming involvement of the United States threatened to turn a seemingly unstoppable war machine into a fragile empire balanced on the edge of miscalculation. By spring, the war had reached a critical juncture. Germany's decision to forego the Soviet campaign had created a force unparalleled in history, but that very concentration of power had introduced vulnerabilities that no one had anticipated. The world now waited, breathless, as the next moves would determine whether this alternate timeline led to German domination or the beginning of an equally devastating global backlash.
April 20th, 1942, northern France and the Low Countries. The Wehrmacht continued its methodical push, armored columns advancing with precise timing, supported by the ever-present Luftwaffe. The snow had melted into muddy fields, slowing some divisions, but German efficiency remained unmatched. Soldiers, though confident in their numerical and technological advantage, began to notice the cumulative strain, fatigue, minor supply disruptions, and the increasingly sophisticated resistance efforts that harassed even the best coordinated operations. Colonel Reinhardt rode along a supply convoy, observing local villages that had begun to organize more coordinated sabotage efforts. Train tracks were damaged, bridges partially destroyed, and communication lines disrupted. "They adapt faster than we anticipated," he muttered to his aide. "This isn't the easy conquest we were promised." Even in this alternate timeline, where the Soviet threat never existed, the Allies and local populations found ways to exploit Germany's focus and occasional overconfidence. Meanwhile, in London, Churchill coordinated with both military and civilian planners. Factories produced an unprecedented number of tanks and aircraft, and special operations forces prepared targeted missions behind German lines. Intelligence suggested that even small disruptions could cascade into serious delays for the Wehrmacht, given the concentration of their resources in the West. RAF pilots trained for coordinated strikes, and convoys from the United States reinforced Britain's capacity to resist, signaling that Germany's advantage was not absolute. In Berlin, the generals grew increasingly aware of these minor setbacks. The absence of the Eastern Front had provided unmatched resources, but it had also made Germany predictable in some ways. Each advance needed careful calculation. Each misstep had magnified consequences. Discussions in Hitler's bunker became more intense, often heated, as officers debated whether to press relentlessly or consolidate gains. "Every victory now must be decisive," General Holder warned. "Otherwise, the Allies will find a way to exploit our single-minded focus." On the ground, civilians endured the strain of occupation under an increasingly tense environment. Resistance movements coordinated more sophisticated acts of sabotage, while German forces responded with rapid, sometimes brutal countermeasures. The human cost escalated, not only through direct combat, but also through the psychological pressure of constant surveillance, fear, and uncertainty. This alternate war was proving to be efficient yet unrelenting, affecting soldiers and civilians alike in ways the original timeline never experienced. As spring deepened, a sense of unease settled over Europe. Germany's concentrated power had brought early successes, but each victory carried new risks. The Allies, adapting to the new reality, began to push back in calculated ways, testing the limits of German logistics, morale, and strategy. The war was no longer just a series of territorial gains. It had become a complex chessboard, with every move capable of triggering a chain reaction that could redefine the course of history.
May 15, 1942, northern France and southern England. The Allies had begun to turn the tide, exploiting subtle weaknesses in Germany's concentrated strategy. British intelligence had intercepted supply routes and German communication patterns, enabling targeted strikes that slowed the Wehrmacht's relentless advance. For the first time, soldiers like Colonel Reinhardt noticed that efficiency alone could not guarantee absolute success. The Allies were adapting faster than anyone had anticipated. In London, Churchill convened a strategic council with American military advisors newly arrived from Washington. Maps were spread across the table, showing German troop movements and areas of vulnerability. "We must force them to overextend," Churchill urged, pointing to lightly defended supply depots. "If we can disrupt their logistics, we can exploit the concentration of their forces against them." Roosevelt, determined yet cautious, nodded. The United States was now fully mobilized, and the flow of troops and materiel into Britain had reached unprecedented levels. Back on the Western Front, the Luftwaffe scrambled to maintain air superiority. Messerschmitts engaged RAF squadrons over the Channel, while Heinkel bombers continued to pound industrial targets. Yet even as Germany struck with surgical precision, every diversion, every supply disruption amplified the strain on their concentrated forces. Soldiers felt the pressure of operating at maximum capacity without the buffer of a secondary front to absorb minor setbacks. Meanwhile, resistance networks across occupied France and the Low Countries became increasingly coordinated. Sabotage missions disrupted rail lines, bridges, and communication hubs, forcing German engineers and troops to divert resources from offensive operations. Civilians quietly assisted by hiding supplies, guiding Allied operatives, and spreading intelligence. In this alternate timeline, the absence of an Eastern Front had made Germany more formidable, but it had also made them predictable and exposed to asymmetric resistance. Inside Berlin, generals debated the next moves. Some advocated pressing the offensive to preempt Allied reinforcements, while others warned of the dangers of overextension. "Every advantage we have," General Keitel cautioned, "comes with an equal risk if we push too far without contingency. The Americans are no longer observers, they are active participants. Their involvement could tip the balance against us." Hitler listened intently, yet his ambition for a decisive Western campaign left little room for compromise. As spring turned to early summer, Europe found itself in a tense equilibrium. Germany's concentrated might had created rapid early victories, but now the Allies' strategic counteroffensive threatened to erode that advantage. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike understood that the war had entered a new, unpredictable phase, one where efficiency and preparation would be tested against ingenuity, resilience, and the full force of global opposition.
June 28, 1942. Normandy, France. The morning fog hung low over fields scarred by artillery fire and armored tracks. Colonel Reinhardt watched as panzer divisions pushed forward, their movements precise but increasingly strained. The Allies had identified critical points of vulnerability, rail junctions, bridges, and supply depots, and targeted them relentlessly. Every disruption forced German engineers and soldiers to work double time, creating exhaustion among men and a rising human cost that was becoming impossible to ignore. In the skies, RAF squadrons executed coordinated bombing raids, focusing on supply depots and forward airfields. Fighter pilots like Flight Lieutenant Edward Thompson skillfully maneuvered their Spitfires against German Messerschmitts, forcing costly engagements that slowly bled Luftwaffe strength. Even in a concentrated war machine, attrition began to manifest, not through the vastness of the Eastern Front, but through the precision and persistence of Allied tactics. Civilians in occupied towns bore witness to the mounting toll. Homes were destroyed in targeted attacks, railways disrupted, and forced requisitions created shortages of food and medicine. Resistance networks, emboldened by the effectiveness of Allied strikes, coordinated daring sabotage missions that further strained German logistics. The war, once a display of nearly flawless military precision, had transformed into a grinding test of endurance for both soldiers and civilians. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals monitored reports from the front with growing concern. The absence of the Soviet campaign had allowed Germany to concentrate unprecedented power in the West, but the Allies' adaptation revealed a harsh reality. Efficiency could not replace foresight. Even small disruptions could ripple through supply lines, creating delays that had previously been unimaginable in a multi-front conflict. Discussions in the bunker grew more urgent, with some generals warning that overconfidence might lead to catastrophic miscalculations. Across the Atlantic, the United States continued its massive mobilization. Convoys delivered tanks, aircraft, and ammunition, tipping the balance of in favor of the Allies in isolated skirmishes. Naval battles became increasingly frequent as Germany attempted to disrupt these supply lines, while American forces honed strategies to support Britain more effectively. Every engagement carried a higher human cost as concentrated German resources collided with determined Allied resistance. By midsummer, it was clear that the Western-focused German strategy had produced both early victories and unforeseen vulnerabilities. The human toll on soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike was rising, and the war had entered a new phase of attrition, one defined not by geography, but by the relentless pressure of concentrated forces meeting adaptable, resilient opposition. Every decision, every battle, and every sacrifice would determine whether Germany's gamble on avoiding the Eastern Front could lead to lasting dominance or set the stage for a decisive Allied resurgence.
July 22, 1942, Northern France. The Wehrmacht had advanced farther than in the original timeline, yet the strain of concentrated operations began to show. Supply lines stretched thin despite meticulous planning. Troops faced exhaustion, and minor mistakes amplified into tactical setbacks. Colonel Reinhardt rode along the front, noting pockets of resistance that delayed convoys and disrupted communications. "We've pushed too far too fast," he muttered to his aide. "The Allies are finally finding cracks in our armor." In London, Churchill and Roosevelt observed these developments with cautious optimism. Allied forces began coordinated counterattacks in areas where German supply lines were most vulnerable. RAF bombing raids intensified, targeting bridges, rail hubs, and depots, while American troops prepared to reinforce British positions along critical frontiers. The concentrated German strategy, once a symbol of invincibility, now faced the reality of overextension. Back in Berlin, tension gripped Hitler's inner circle. Reports of delays, minor defeats, and resistance operations were now impossible to ignore. General Keitel warned, "Concentrating all forces in the West was unprecedented, but every advance now risks collapse. The Americans are mobilizing fully, and the Allies are exploiting our extended supply lines." Hitler listened, yet his ambition for rapid, decisive victory left little room for hesitation. On the ground, soldiers felt the shifting momentum. What had begun as a near-perfect campaign was now a war of attrition, where fatigue, logistical errors, and persistent Allied resistance threatened to undermine earlier gains. Villages that once surrendered quietly now resisted with sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla tactics. Civilians suffered as the war intensified, enduring bombing, forced requisitions, and displacement. The human cost was mounting, proof that even concentrated military power could not escape the toll of prolonged conflict. Across the Atlantic, U.S. forces accelerated production and troop deployment. Convoys carrying Sherman tanks, P-47 Thunderbolts, and artillery reached Britain with increasing frequency. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany's operational tempo was unsustainable without overextending resources, and Allied planners seized the opportunity to strike at the weakest points. Every misstep, every delayed supply train, and every fatigued unit became a potential turning point in the war. By late summer, the war had entered a critical phase. Germany's gamble, avoiding the Eastern Front to focus entirely on Western conquest, had produced rapid gains, but the concentrated force was beginning to show the vulnerabilities of overreach. The Allies, adapting strategically and logistically, were poised to exploit these weaknesses. The outcome of the war, once seemingly predetermined by German efficiency, was now balanced on a knife's edge, where every decision, action, and miscalculation could tip the scale in favor of ultimate victory or defeat.
August 30th, 1942. Normandy and the Low Countries. The Allies launched coordinated offensives along several fronts, exploiting Germany's overextended lines. Infantry advanced cautiously, supported by artillery and tanks, while RAF squadrons maintained constant pressure on German supply routes. Soldiers on both sides felt the weight of every action. Each move had consequences for the broader campaign, and the concentrated German forces now faced challenges they had not anticipated. Colonel Reinhardt inspected forward positions, noting increasing delays in supply convoys and a rise in ambushes by resistance fighters. "We've underestimated them," he admitted quietly. "Efficiency can only take you so far." Even the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain total air superiority, engaging in prolonged dogfights that strained pilots and aircraft alike. The war, once defined by German precision, now increasingly tested adaptability, endurance, and ingenuity. In London, Churchill's War Cabinet monitored reports with cautious optimism. Roosevelt had committed more troops and supplies, creating a synchronized transatlantic effort to support Britain's defenses. Strategic planners focused on weakening Germany's concentrated positions, targeting choke points and overstretched supply depots. The Allies' coordinated actions began to slow the German advance, forcing commanders in Berlin to reconsider their ambitious timelines. Back in Berlin, tension ran high. Generals debated whether to continue pressing forward or to consolidate gains, wary of the mounting strain on soldiers and resources. "Our forces are powerful, yes, but they are stretched thin. Any major miscalculation could undo months of progress." Hitler, still ambitious for a decisive victory, faced the difficult task of balancing rapid advances with the reality of overextension. Civilians in occupied Europe endured escalating hardships. Bombing raids, sabotage, and skirmishes disrupted everyday life, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty. Resistance networks became increasingly bold, striking German supply lines, ambushing patrols, and transmitting intelligence to Allied forces. The very efficiency that had initially overwhelmed them now made German forces vulnerable to concentrated, strategic counterattacks. By early September, the tide of the Western campaign had shifted. Germany's decision to avoid the Eastern Front had granted unmatched power and speed, but the concentrated focus had also created fragile points in the Wehrmacht's operational structure. The Allies, leveraging coordination, technology, and local intelligence, began to turn the concentrated German advantage into a potential liability. The war, once seemingly predetermined by German efficiency, was now entering a phase of high-stakes uncertainty where every choice mattered. September 25th, 1942. Northern France. The German advance, once swift and unstoppable, had slowed to a cautious crawl. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers, convoys slowed by sabotage, weather, and fatigue. Soldiers, despite their training and discipline, felt the weight of months of continuous operations.
Colonel Reinhardt walked among his troops, noting exhaustion etched into faces and the subtle signs of fraying morale. "We are strong," he admitted to his aide, "but we are not invincible." In Berlin, the atmosphere was tense. Hitler's generals debated strategy with increasing urgency. Reports of Allied counteroffensives, disrupted supply lines, and growing resistance activity painted a picture of vulnerability that had not existed during the early months of the concentrated campaign. General Keitel warned, "We must consider consolidating our gains. Pushing further without pause risks collapse." Hitler, ambitious and unyielding, faced the difficult choice between relentless offense and strategic prudence. Across the Channel, Allied forces pressed their advantage. RAF bombing raids targeted depots and transport hubs, while British and American infantry executed carefully coordinated strikes on weakly defended positions. Resistance networks amplified these efforts, exploiting every flaw in the German logistics chain. For the first time, the concentrated Wehrmacht found itself reacting defensively, forced to protect its gains rather than expand them. The human toll was escalating. Soldiers endured long hours in the field with minimal rest. Civilians faced increasing shortages, displacement, and danger. Villages along key routes were frequently contested, turning once peaceful towns into battle zones. The war, which had initially seemed a display of unmatched German precision, now exposed the vulnerabilities of overextension and relentless pressure. Morale among German troops began to reflect the broader strain. Discipline remained intact, but whispers of frustration and fear circulated quietly. Officers noted the growing psychological burden of constant engagement and extended supply lines. Even small miscalculations by commanders had amplified consequences, revealing that efficiency alone could not secure victory indefinitely. By late September, the first signs of a potential stalemate emerged. Germany's concentrated strategy had produced rapid victories, but the overextension of forces, combined with resilient Allied resistance and American involvement, suggested that continued advances might be unsustainable. The war, once dominated by speed and precision, was entering a phase where endurance, coordination, and adaptability would determine outcomes, challenging the very premise of Germany's Western-focused gamble.
October 18, 1942, Northern France. The Wehrmacht, despite its early dominance, faced mounting pressure as the Allies launched coordinated counteroffensives across multiple fronts. Colonel Reinhardt observed tank units diverted to protect stretched supply lines, while infantry was tasked with defensive operations rather than offensive maneuvers. The concentration of forces that had once been Germany's greatest strength now exposed critical vulnerabilities. In London, Churchill and Roosevelt watched these developments with cautious satisfaction. Allied intelligence pinpointed overstretched German positions and logistical bottlenecks. Bombing raids targeted critical depots and communication hubs, while American troops reinforced British positions along the coast. Every disruption had a magnified effect, highlighting the unintended consequences of Germany's single-minded focus on the West. Inside Berlin, Hitler's inner circle grew increasingly divided. Some generals urged a temporary consolidation of forces to stabilize the front and address supply challenges, while others argued for pressing forward to maintain momentum. "We are at the edge of our operational capacity," warned General Halder. "Any overreach now could undo all the gains we have made." Hitler, however, remained determined to seize a decisive victory before Allied forces could fully mobilize. On the ground, German soldiers endured exhausting routines. Convoys delayed by sabotage and attacks required rerouting. Artillery units worked around the clock, and pilots faced relentless sorties against increasingly coordinated RAF formations.
The psychological strain was evident. Exhaustion, stress, and the awareness of being constantly challenged eroded confidence. Even Colonel Reinhardt, a seasoned officer, sensed the limits of his force's endurance. Civilians bore the escalating consequences of this concentrated war. Towns along key supply lines were repeatedly attacked, infrastructure strained under repeated occupation, and shortages of essential goods worsened. Resistance movements grew bolder, seizing the opportunity to strike at a force that, while powerful, was now spread thinner than ever. Every act of defiance became a multiplier in the strategic calculus of the war. By late October, Germany's concentrated strategy, once its defining advantage, was increasingly a liability. The absence of the Eastern Front had allowed for early gains, but overextension, rising casualties, and the relentless Allied push were now reshaping the conflict. The Wehrmacht faced a pivotal moment: continue pressing at great risk, or consolidate gains and potentially lose momentum in the face of a mobilizing global coalition.
November 23, 1942. Northern France and the Low Countries. The Allied counteroffensive reached a critical point. American and British forces coordinated large-scale attacks on German supply hubs, while RAF bombers relentlessly targeted armored units and rail lines. Colonel Reinhardt observed panzer divisions slowed by disrupted logistics, soldiers forced to improvise under mounting stress. The concentrated force that had once surged with unstoppable momentum now faced a war of attrition that Germany had not anticipated. In London, Churchill and Roosevelt reviewed intelligence reports with a mix of determination and relief. The Allies had successfully exploited the vulnerabilities created by Germany's overextended Western Front. Strategic strikes had delayed offensives, reduced morale, and allowed resistance groups to operate more effectively. Every successful disruption forced German commanders into reactive decisions, undermining their November 23, 1942. Northern France and the Low Countries. The Allied counteroffensive reached a critical point. American and British forces coordinated large-scale attacks on German supply hubs, while RAF bombers relentlessly targeted armored units and rail lines. Colonel Reinhardt observed panzer divisions slowed by disrupted logistics, soldiers forced to improvise under mounting stress. The concentrated force that had once surged with unstoppable momentum now faced a war of attrition that Germany had not anticipated. In London, Churchill and Roosevelt reviewed intelligence reports with a mix of determination and relief. The Allies had successfully exploited the vulnerabilities created by Germany's overextended Western Front. Strategic strikes had delayed offensives, reduced morale, and allowed resistance groups to operate more effectively. Every successful disruption forced German commanders into reactive decisions, undermining their earlier precision. Back in Berlin, tension reached unprecedented levels. Hitler's generals warned that pushing forward without pause could risk a catastrophic collapse. "We cannot sustain this tempo indefinitely," General Keitel argued. "Our soldiers are exhausted, our supply lines stretched, and the Allies grow stronger by the day." Hitler, ever determined, struggled between maintaining the offensive and acknowledging the limits of concentrated power. Even his closest advisors sensed that the gamble of avoiding the Eastern Front had reached its precarious apex. On the ground, German soldiers experienced the human cost acutely. Units that had been highly efficient were now forced into defensive maneuvers, facing ambushes and sabotage from a population increasingly emboldened by the Allied push. Civilians bore the cumulative weight of war. Towns were destroyed, families displaced, and resources scarce. Resistance fighters coordinated daring operations that further strained the already taxed Wehrmacht. The combination of overextension, Allied coordination, and local resistance signaled a turning point. Germany's concentrated strength, initially a decisive advantage, had become a liability, exposing vulnerabilities the Allies could exploit.
The war's momentum shifted. The Western campaign no longer guaranteed rapid victory, but instead threatened to bog Germany down in a prolonged struggle with escalating human and material costs. As winter approached, Europe braced for the next phase of the conflict. Germany's gamble, foregoing the Eastern Front to focus exclusively on the West, had created unprecedented early advantages, but the Allies were now seizing control of the initiative. The stage was set for a clash of attrition, ingenuity, and endurance, one that would ultimately determine the outcome of this alternate history. December 31st, 1942, northern France. Winter had set in, turning muddy fields into treacherous terrain. The Wehrmacht, though still formidable, now faced the full brunt of Allied coordination and strategic pressure. Colonel Reinhardt observed his troops moving cautiously, armored units redeployed defensively, and supply convoys constantly harassed by resistance attacks. The concentrated German strategy, once a symbol of invincibility, was now strained to the breaking point. In London, Churchill and Roosevelt celebrated cautious victories. Allied forces had successfully slowed German advances, inflicted significant material losses, and gained momentum for planned offensives in the spring. The combined power of British determination, American industrial might, and local resistance had begun to erode the Wehrmacht's operational dominance. Each Allied success magnified Germany's overextension, creating pressure points that threatened their overall strategic position. Back in Berlin, Hitler's confidence wavered as reports of disrupted supply lines, exhausted troops, and mounting casualties arrived daily. Generals urged caution, recommending consolidation and defensive fortification. "The gamble has run its course," General Keitel warned. "Our focus on the West has brought early gains, but the Allies now dictate the tempo. Continuing unchecked could result in disaster." Hitler, for the first time, faced the tangible consequences of a strategy that had initially seemed flawless. On the Western Front, German soldiers felt the human cost acutely. Fatigue, harsh winter conditions, and constant harassment by Allied forces and resistance fighters sapped morale. Civilians endured repeated bombings, food shortages, and forced evacuations. Every advance, every operation carried risks, magnified by Germany's earlier choice to concentrate forces in the West. Even the most efficient divisions were now vulnerable to attrition and strategic pressure. By early 1943, it was evident that Germany's Western-focused strategy had achieved rapid early success, but ultimately created critical vulnerabilities. The absence of an Eastern front spared resources initially, yet it also meant that Germany had overextended itself, exposing weaknesses that the Allies could exploit with combined military, logistical, and intelligence efforts. The concentrated power that seemed unstoppable now faltered under the relentless, adaptive pressure of a global coalition. In this alternate history, Germany's decision not to invade the Soviet Union had reshaped the course of the war. Early dominance was achieved through focus and precision, but unchecked concentration led to overreach, escalating human costs and strategic vulnerability. The war had entered a new phase, one defined not by raw power alone, but by endurance, coordination, and the ability to respond to a coalition that had learned to turn Germany's strengths into its weaknesses.
March 10, 1943, Northern France and Western Europe. After months of attrition and coordinated Allied pressure, the tide had clearly shifted. The Wehrmacht, once concentrated and unstoppable, now faced repeated setbacks, logistical nightmares, and waning morale. Colonel Reinhardt walked through battered villages and exhausted forward positions, noting the toll on both soldiers and civilians.
The concentrated strategy that had initially seemed a masterstroke was unraveling under the weight of sustained adaptive opposition. In London, Churchill addressed the nation with cautious optimism. Britain had survived the most intense period of German focus and was now gaining ground alongside American reinforcements. Allied successes in disrupting German supply lines and striking key military targets had proven that concentrated power alone could not ensure victory. Strategic planning shifted toward exploiting weaknesses and reclaiming territory, a stark contrast to the desperate defensive posture months earlier. Back in Berlin, Hitler's confidence eroded as the reality of overreach became undeniable. Generals debated how to stabilize the front, repair supply chains, and conserve troops for future operations. Many warned that continued aggression without pause could result in catastrophic losses. Germany's gamble, forsaking the Eastern Front for Western dominance, had delivered impressive early gains, but it had also exposed vulnerabilities that ultimately shifted the balance of power. On the ground, German soldiers faced increasing resistance, harsh winter conditions, and relentless Allied offensives. Civilians who had endured the concentrated war effort now bore the consequences of prolonged conflict, destruction, scarcity, and displacement. Resistance networks continued to exploit every weakness, while Allied forces pushed forward methodically, turning Germany's initial advantage into a gradual but decisive decline. By mid-1943, the Western-focused strategy had reached its inevitable conclusion. Germany's early victories had not translated into lasting dominance. The Allies, leveraging intelligence, coordination, and reinforcements from the United States, had regained initiative. The war entered a prolonged phase where Germany was forced to consolidate and defend rather than expand, and the human cost across Europe had escalated dramatically. In this alternate history, the choice to avoid the Eastern Front reshaped not only military operations, but also the geopolitical landscape. Early precision and concentration had delivered temporary dominance, but the lack of attritional buffering, overextension, and adaptive Allied responses ensured that Germany's supremacy was neither absolute nor sustainable. The lessons of this scenario were clear. Power without balance, focus without foresight, and success without adaptability can turn advantage into vulnerability. The stage was now set for the Allies to continue their push, reclaim territory, and ultimately define the post-war world. Germany's gamble, bold and initially brilliant, had reshaped the course of history, but it had also demonstrated the limits of concentrated military power in a global conflict defined by endurance, strategy, and human resilience.
June 2, 1943, Europe. The dust of battle had begun to settle, yet the scars of Germany's Western-focused campaign were evident across the continent. Cities lay in partial ruin, railways were damaged, and millions of civilians bore the consequences of relentless warfare. Soldiers, both German and Allied, reflected on the unprecedented speed and intensity of the conflict. Colonel Reinhardt, now observing the front from a forward command post, understood that the concentrated force Germany had wielded was both its greatest strength and its ultimate vulnerability. In Berlin, historians and military analysts within the German High Command began to debate the implications of their strategy. The decision not to invade the Soviet Union had created short-term gains, but the overextension, mounting casualties, and rapid Allied adaptation had undermined long-term dominance. Political and military leaders now faced the task of re-evaluating strategy, resources, and objectives in a Europe increasingly resistant to absolute German control. At the Atlantic, the United States and Britain consolidated their victories, rebuilding infrastructure, fortifying defenses, and planning further offensives. The coordinated effort demonstrated the effectiveness of adaptability, resourcefulness, and coalition warfare.
Lessons learned from Germany's concentrated approach would inform Allied strategy, that overwhelming power could be neutralized by overreach, and that patience, coordination, and strategic targeting could turn the tide even against a highly efficient enemy. Civilians in liberated territories slowly began to rebuild, though memories of occupation, destruction, and fear lingered. Resistance movements, emboldened by the Allied counteroffensives, continued to shape local governance and recovery efforts. The war had proven that human resilience, adaptability, and coordinated effort could counter even a seemingly unstoppable military machine. In retrospect, Germany's alternate Western-focused strategy had reshaped the war in dramatic ways. Early dominance was achieved through unparalleled concentration of forces, precise coordination, and innovation. Yet the very same concentration created vulnerabilities that allowed adaptive allies to regain the initiative. The human cost was staggering, with soldiers and civilians alike bearing the brunt of a war intensified by efficiency and overreach. The ultimate lesson of this alternate timeline was clear. Military power, when concentrated without balance or foresight, can achieve rapid gains, but is ultimately vulnerable to sustained, adaptive opposition. Germany's gamble not to invade the Soviet Union had altered the trajectory of World War II, creating a war of unmatched intensity in the West, yet demonstrating that even the most formidable forces can be challenged by strategy, resilience, and the enduring human will. The continent stood battered but resilient, a testament to both the dangers of overreach and the power of collective resistance. History, even in its alternate form, had proven that no single strategy, no matter how precise, could guarantee dominance in a world defined by complexity, unpredictability, and human determination.